I stood at my wife's grave on the day I should have been standing beside my son. But he wasn't there. He chose birthday candles for his wife over the candle of remembrance. I stayed silent, though everything inside me was screaming. The next day, he came, not with an apology, but with a request for help. His voice sounded like a command, as if I was still obligated to rescue him. I handed him a gift he never expected. It had no ribbon, but inside was everything he had lost. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Harold Kent. I was 72 years old the day I buried my wife. For 37 years, I worked as a lineman for the electric company in Minnesota. The job left my back sore, my fingers calloused, and my hearing somewhat dulled from decades of working near humming transformers and crackling high wires. But none of that prepared me for the silence that followed her death. The morning of the funeral, I buttoned my shirt in the bedroom we had shared since 1985. Her side of the closet was still full. Wool sweaters, linen blouses, one red dress she never wore but couldn't throw out. I had kept everything in place. I don't know if it was out of respect or fear. Maybe both. The pillow still held the curve of her head, and I hadn't turned down the bed on her side since the night the ambulance took her away. That morning, I avoided looking at it. The air outside carried a sharpness I hadn't felt in years, not just because autumn had come early, but because it sliced through the numbness I had worn like armor. The funeral home van had brought the casket to the small churchyard we had chosen together years ago. It stood on a low hill outside of town, surrounded by oaks and quiet, and I used to think of it as a peaceful place for a stranger. Now it was hers. Now it was mine. I stood under a sky drained of all color. There was no sun, no shadow, just a flat sheet of gray that pressed everything downward. My boots sank into the soft ground beside her grave. I felt rooted and drifting all at once. People had gathered, of course. Neighbors, some of her book club friends, 2 women from the grocery store she used to chat with about coupons. One of the guys from my old crew showed up with his wife, both of them dressed in black that looked brand new. They offered small nods, the kind people give when they don't know what to say, and feel like words might do more harm than good. I nodded back. But my son, Alan, was not there. The seat next to me on the folding chair under the canopy remained empty. The wind tugged at the corners of the green tarp overhead, and a small wreath fell sideways onto the grass. I didn't move to fix it. I kept my hands folded over my cane. My eyes didn't leave the casket, and I barely heard the pastor's voice. Words about peace, love, faith. Words that sounded like they belonged in a Hallmark card, not at the foot of a grave. I had tried to call Alan the night before, just once. The line rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I figured if he planned to come, he'd be there. And if he didn't, no words would change that. But even then, some stubborn part of me clung to hope that he'd appear at the last minute, breathless, with regret in his eyes. That maybe, just maybe, he still had it in him to remember where he came from. Instead, he sent a text that morning. Can't make it. Nicole's birthday. Hope it goes okay. Hope it goes okay. I stared at those 5 words until the phone screen went dark in my hand. Then I turned it off completely and slid it into my coat pocket. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't shatter something. The ceremony ended quickly. The casket lowered slowly, like a reluctant goodbye. People drifted away in small clusters, whispering the same soft condolences they had whispered at every other funeral they'd ever attended. I let them leave. I didn't shake hands. I didn't smile. I waited until the grounds crew began to shovel the first layer of dirt over the polished wood. That sound, dirt striking the top of a casket, is not something you ever forget. It's final. It's cruel in its simplicity. No hymn, no prayer, no floral arrangement softens it. I stood and walked to the edge of the grave, my boots sinking again into the wet soil. I looked down, and for a moment I couldn't see her. I could only see the years. All the years we had built together, compressed into this one space, this one box, this one awful moment of closure. Her name was Margaret. We met in 1972 at a gas station where I was replacing a faulty transformer, and she was arguing with the clerk about the price of windshield wipers. I liked her fire. She never lost it, not even at the end, when her body failed, but her eyes stayed sharp. She was the kind of woman who made a home out of anything. An apartment, a trailer, a run-down house with leaky windows and creaky steps. She made soup when I had the flu, paid the bills when I forgot, and held my hand when I got laid off in '92. She was my memory, my mirror, my voice when mine broke. And she was gone. As the last bit of soil covered the lowered casket, I crouched and touched the grass near the edge. It was damp, cold, indifferent. I let my hand rest there for a moment, then stood and walked away, without turning back. There was no need. What mattered had already been buried deeper than 6 feet of earth. Back at the car, I sat in the driver's seat for a long while without starting the engine. The windshield fogged with my breath. The funeral program sat folded on the passenger seat, her name printed in gold script across the front. I didn't open it. I didn't want to see the dates. Dates turn people into math. She deserved more than that. Alan used to sit in that passenger seat. I could remember his legs dangling above the floor mats, swinging back and forth. He'd ask me when we'd stop for milkshakes. He'd talk about dinosaurs, then space, then football, then girls. I drove him to school, to college, to his first job interview. And now, on the day his mother was buried, the seat was empty. Not just empty, but abandoned. I put the key in the ignition and turned it, but didn't drive off right away. Instead, I stared out at the cemetery from behind the fogged glass. The wind moved the trees in slow, tired arcs, as though they too were mourning. I sat in that quiet, and in that quiet, I realized something had shifted. There are losses you expect, accidents, illnesses, age. You brace for them, even when they come too soon. But the loss of someone who's still alive, who chooses not to stand beside you in grief, that loss leaves no grave to visit, no stone to touch. It just hollows you out and keeps hollowing until you're not sure if there's anything left to scoop. When I finally drove away, I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't stop for coffee. I didn't even cry. I just kept driving, 1 mile at a time, with the silence beside me like a passenger that had no plans of leaving anytime soon. The house hadn't changed in any obvious way, but everything in it felt wrong. The front door creaked the same way it always had, and the hallway rug curled at the same corner where I had tripped over it for years. The lamp in the foyer still cast its yellowish light too dimly, and the smell of cedar and old paper lingered in the air, like it always did after autumn rain. But stepping inside felt like stepping into a photograph, flat, faded, and painfully still. I left my coat on the rack and my shoes near the mat, out of habit more than necessity. The living room waited at the end of the hall, and as I turned toward it, I felt a tightening in my chest, not sharp like a heart attack, but slow and spreading, like ice under the skin. There, by the window, stood the armchair. It was brown leather, worn soft from years of use, with a faded quilt draped over the back and a cushion that sagged slightly on one side. It wasn't an expensive piece of furniture. Margaret bought it at a second-hand shop during a winter when money was tight and Alan had just started school. She joked that it had character and that the scratches on the armrest made it look distinguished. Over time, it became her chair. No one else ever truly sat there. It was where she read the paper in the morning, where she knitted scarves she rarely finished, where she'd fold laundry while humming songs that belonged to a different generation. During the last year of her illness, it became the only place she found comfort. A small patch of peace in a body that no longer cooperated. I had adjusted the floor lamp beside it, brought her tea, her pills, and sometimes just silence. That chair had witnessed the quiet erosion of her strength in a way no hospital bed ever could. And now, it was empty. I stood in the doorway for a long time, unsure whether to cross the room. Something about the way the cushion held the faint memory of her weight made it feel like stepping closer would disturb a sacred space. The sun filtered through the blinds in narrow stripes, catching the dust in the air, and I thought about how she used to scold me for letting the windows go too long without cleaning. She always noticed things like that. I rarely did. Across from the chair was the couch. That's where Alan used to sprawl when he visited. Remote in one hand, phone in the other, legs thrown over the side like he owned the place. I could still see him there, 13 years old and sulking because we'd made him shut off the television and go to bed. I could see him there at 25, grown but not grown up, talking too loud about his plans and too little about the people who made those plans possible. The last time he was here, months ago, maybe longer, he sat in that very spot, texting during dinner, pretending not to hear his mother when she asked about his work. She had looked at him like she was searching for someone inside him, someone she remembered. I didn't say much then. I had already learned that saying things didn't always mean they were heard. Now his absence echoed louder than any voice. I walked into the room and sat on the edge of the coffee table facing the chair. My knees cracked as I lowered myself. I folded my hands and stared at the cushion, expecting it to move, somehow, just a little. But it didn't. The silence in the room was absolute, the kind that feels alive and listening. The mantel above the fireplace held a small row of photographs. Alan as a baby, red-faced and screaming. Alan in Little League, holding a bat like it was a sword. Margaret in the kitchen, flour on her nose, smiling at the camera like she knew something no one else did. Us at the lake in 1989. Us at the Grand Canyon in 97. Us. I tried to recall the last time we all sat in this room together without discomfort. Not just physically present, but truly together. No distractions, no coldness, no distance dressed up as civility. I couldn't find the memory. It was either too far away, or it never really existed. I leaned forward and rested my elbows on my thighs. My fingers were stiff from the cold. The heater hadn't kicked on yet, and I hadn't bothered to adjust the thermostat. There didn't seem to be much point. The house could stay cold for now. From the chair, Margaret used to read aloud sometimes. Newspaper headlines, book excerpts, even the back of cereal boxes. She had a voice that could make anything sound like poetry. I used to think I didn't appreciate it enough. I was probably right. The television remote sat on the side table, untouched. Her glasses were still there too, folded neatly, the lenses smudged with fingerprints she never cleaned properly. I picked them up and held them for a moment, the arms bending slightly under my grip. Then I placed them back, exactly where they had been. I wasn't ready to move anything yet. The worst part wasn't that she was gone. It was that no one else seemed to feel the size of the hole she'd left behind. Alan hadn't called. Not once. Not after the funeral. Not before it. And certainly not during. His wife had posted photos online of their child's birthday cake. Pink frosting, cartoon decorations, smiles all around. I had seen them by accident when my niece showed me her phone at the reception. She thought I'd want to see how grown up my granddaughter looked. I nodded and pretended to smile. But all I could think of was the chair. The chair where Margaret should have sat that day, had life been fair. The chair where Alan should have looked and remembered who had once rocked him through fevers and fear, who had sewed the patches on his jeans and clapped at every school play. The chair that should have held more than silence. Instead, it stood alone, untouched, a monument to what had been ignored. As the day wore on, the light shifted. Shadows stretched across the floor, thin and deliberate. I stayed in the room longer than I meant to. I didn't turn on any lamps. I didn't close the curtains. I just sat and watched the chair, as if waiting for something to happen. A flicker, a sigh, a whisper, anything. But the house remained still. I eventually rose, joints complaining, and left the room without touching a thing. The chair stayed behind, quiet and proud, the last witness to everything I once had, and everything I no longer did. When I closed the front door behind me that afternoon, the sound of the latch echoed too long. It rebounded off the walls, slid under the baseboards, and settled into the crevices between floorboards where old noise lived. After that, there was nothing. Just stillness so deep, it felt like pressure on the skin. I stood in the entryway for a few seconds, holding my keys too tightly, unsure where to go next. There was no urgency, no voice calling from another room, no scent of dinner warming on the stove. The house waited, the way it always had, but this time it waited for no one. The air had that stale edge that creeps in after a place has been left alone too long. Not foul, not sour, just flat, like cardboard. I didn't open a window. I didn't need fresh air. I needed time to slow down, or maybe to stop altogether. I placed the keys in the ceramic dish by the door. Margaret had bought it at a craft fair decades ago. It had a chip on one edge that she used to joke gave it character. I always thought it made it look broken. Now I realized it was both. The living room, still dim from drawn curtains, offered no welcome. The couch, with its lumpy cushions and throw blanket that never quite matched anything else in the room, sat undisturbed. The coffee table still bore the faint white rings from mugs of tea, set down without coasters. I had once tried to scrub them out with vinegar and baking soda, but Margaret had laughed and told me to let them be. Signs of life, she called them. Now they just looked like stains. I moved slowly through the hallway, running my fingers along the wall as I went. The paint had dulled in places where our hands had lingered too often. Near the thermostat, by the laundry room, around the archway into the kitchen. Small patterns of wear that mapped the habits of a life now paused. The kitchen was the hardest. I stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, reluctant to step in. The mug was still there, beside the sink. Her mug, pale blue with a tiny crack on the inside that she always ignored. She drank her morning tea from it every day, sitting by the window that looked out over the backyard. Sometimes she'd hum softly while the water boiled. She never rushed breakfast. She believed in beginning the day slowly, gently. I used to tease her about it. Now I'd have given anything to hear that quiet hum just once more. I walked over and touched the handle of the mug. It was colder than I expected, as if reminding me that its owner hadn't held it in a long time. I didn't move it. I left it exactly where it had been. Some objects become anchors. Some become ghosts. That mug had become both. The kettle sat untouched on the stove. Next to it, a half-full jar of honey with a spoon still resting beside it. The last time she used it, she'd been coughing. I remembered watching her stir honey into her tea with slow, deliberate turns, as if sweetness could quiet what medicine could not. She hadn't looked at me then. She was already drifting inward. I didn't stop her. I opened the fridge without knowing why. The light flickered on and bathed the shelves in artificial blue. Leftovers sat in containers she had labeled in her careful cursive. I saw a note on a butter tub. For Thursday soup. She hadn't made it to Thursday. I shut the door too quickly, the suction causing another echo through the room. It sounded like a breath being drawn and held. I wandered through the rest of the house with no destination in mind. Each room bore her fingerprints, a scarf draped over the banister, a paperback with a cracked spine beside the bed, shoes neatly lined up in the closet, as if waiting their turn. I didn't touch anything. I just looked. Our bedroom was dim. The blinds were shut, and the lamp on her side of the bed had not been turned on in weeks. I sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the dresser. Her jewelry box stood open, the velvet inside undisturbed. A pair of earrings lay beside it, ones she had meant to fix. I remembered the day she'd noticed the clasp was broken. She'd set them there and said she'd get to it, soon. Soon had vanished. On her nightstand sat a stack of get-well cards, some from neighbors, some from friends she hadn't seen in years. I picked one up and read the message inside. Words of hope, of prayers, of strength, all written with good intentions, all now irrelevant. Hope can't outpace time. Prayers can't reverse biology, and strength doesn't always win. I put the card back and turned off the lamp, even though it was already off. A habit, something to do with my hands. Back in the hallway, I paused by the door to Alan's old room. I hadn't opened it in years. I reached for the handle, hesitated, then pulled away. I didn't need to see the past today. The present was heavy enough. The silence was not a blanket. It was a weight. It didn't soothe. It pressed down, pressing memories into the corners of the walls and curling around the floorboards. It had rhythm, though. A kind of pulse, like the house was breathing just out of sync with me. Every creak of wood, every tick of the old thermostat, sounded louder than it should have. The kind of silence that amplifies regret. I returned to the kitchen and stood in the center, looking around like a stranger seeing it for the first time. The calendar on the fridge still marked appointments she'd never make. Doctor's visits, a cousin's birthday, a dentist reminder we both pretended not to care about. I found a pen on the counter and crossed out the date. I don't know why. It didn't make anything real, but it felt like acknowledgement. When night fell, I didn't turn on many lights. Just one in the hallway and one over the sink. The kind of light that doesn't pretend to chase away the dark, just sits with it quietly. I boiled water out of routine and made tea, but I didn't drink it. I left the mug beside hers, untouched. Before bed, I sat again in the living room, staring at the empty chair. The silence followed me there too, but now it had softened. Not because anything had changed, but because my resistance to it had faded. I realized that silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's memory. Sometimes it's the only thing that stays when everything else has gone. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, not to hide, not to grieve, but to listen. And the house, though empty, whispered back in its own quiet way, not with answers, just with presence. And for that moment, it was enough. That morning, I sat in the den with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold and a blanket draped over my knees. The sky outside was the kind that didn't promise anything. No storm, no sun, just a dull gray stretch that mirrored the air in my chest. The house had been silent for hours, except for the occasional creak of the baseboards adjusting to the changing temperature. I hadn't turned on the radio. I hadn't turned on the television. I just sat there, staring at the edge of the rug and letting the slow river of memory pull me under. Alan had been a quiet baby. Not sickly, not fussy, just calm, observant. He used to look at me with those dark, serious eyes that made him seem older than he was. Margaret said he had an old soul. I didn't know what that meant back then. I thought she was just being poetic. But the boy rarely cried. He studied faces like he was memorizing them. He learned to walk late, but ran fast when he finally did. I remembered holding him for the first time. His entire body fit in the crook of my arm, no heavier than a loaf of bread. I had stared at his face for what felt like hours, stunned by how familiar and foreign it looked. His fingers wrapped around my thumb, and that single grip rewired everything I thought I knew about strength. In that moment, I believed fatherhood would be simple, instinctive, but it wasn't. Not even close. When he was 5, I built him a treehouse in the backyard. It wasn't much, Just a few planks nailed together, a ladder I measured wrong the first time, and a rope swing that never hung quite straight. But to him, it was a fortress, a kingdom. He would spend hours up there, talking to himself, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the birds. I used to stand at the kitchen window and watch him, trying to see what he saw. He had a world in his head I was never quite allowed into. Even then, the gap between us had a shape. He loved dinosaurs, not just in the way kids go through phases, but with the intensity of someone who needed to know everything. He could name them all: Triceratops, Stegosaurus, Diplodocus, long before he could tie his shoes. We used to read picture books together, and he'd correct me if I mispronounced anything. He had a little green T-Rex he carried everywhere, even to bed. Once we left it at a grocery store by accident, and he cried for an hour until I drove back to get it. It was sitting on the customer service counter like it had been waiting for us. Those were the good years, the golden ones, I suppose, before adolescence built walls, before opinions turned into arguments, before his world started filling with people who weren't us. I remembered the night he broke his arm falling off his bike. Margaret had been out running errands, and I was the one who lifted him off the pavement, his face pale and his lips trembling, but not crying. He didn't shed a single tear until we reached the hospital, and even then, it was just one. He was brave. He was always brave. I held his hand during the X-rays and promised him it would be fine. And it was, mostly. But that night, after we came home, I sat beside his bed long after he fell asleep, wondering why I felt so helpless. When he was 11, we built a birdhouse together. It was for a school project, but he insisted on doing most of it himself. He hammered with more enthusiasm than skill, and I ended up sanding the edges after he went to bed. He painted it bright yellow and put it up on the fence post near the garden. Birds never came to it, not once. But he checked it every morning anyway, hopeful. I kept that birdhouse in the shed after we took it down. The paint had faded, the wood had warped, but I hadn't thrown it away. It didn't matter if no birds ever came. It mattered that he had built it, that we had done it together. There was a summer, he must have been 13, when we went fishing every weekend. He wasn't particularly interested in fish. He liked the quiet. Or maybe he just liked the idea of being out on the water, with no one around to tell him what to do. We'd pack sandwiches and soda and drive out to the lake, and he'd sit on the edge of the dock with his legs swinging, casting the line and talking about nothing in particular. I used to think those were the moments I'd remember forever, and I was right. They've never left me. He grew taller than me by 16, started shaving at 17, got his license and stopped needing rides. At some point, he stopped telling me things, not in a cruel way, just in that way sons do, quietly, like a door closing gently in the middle of the night. I didn't notice it all at once. It happened in pieces. One skipped dinner, one unanswered call, one holiday where he came late and left early. I remembered the time he asked me for help with his taxes. That was one of the last times he asked for anything that wasn't money. I sat with him at the dining table, explaining forms, pointing at numbers, and he nodded like he was listening, but barely heard me. His phone buzzed twice, and he texted with one hand while pretending to care. I wanted to believe he needed me, but I think he just needed it done. He used to laugh more. As a child, his laughter was sudden and explosive, like a surprise. The kind of laugh that shook his whole body and made everyone else join in, whether they understood the joke or not. I tried to recall the last time I heard it. I couldn't. Somewhere along the way, his laughter changed. It became quieter, measured, something shared with others but not with me. Sitting in that room, I realized I had spent years holding on to snapshots of him, fragments, flashes, not the man he had become, but the boy he had been. The boy who asked me how clouds worked. The boy who once told me he wanted to be the guy who fixes bridges. The boy who cried when his goldfish died and made a tiny cross out of toothpicks to bury it in the backyard. I held all of that inside me, and none of it seemed to live in him anymore. I reached for the photo album on the shelf, the old one with the peeling corners and the cracked spine. I flipped through it slowly, each page thick with years. There he was, sitting in Margaret's lap. There he was at the beach, burying my legs in the sand. There he was in a Halloween costume we made from cardboard and duct tape, smiling, reaching, belonging. I closed the album and placed it back where it had been. I didn't need to see more. I needed to understand less. I needed to stop pretending that time could be reversed by remembering hard enough. The silence in the house didn't mock me. It didn't comfort me either. It just existed, like the shadow of a child who used to run down the hallway calling my name. And I sat there, not expecting an echo, just listening anyway. Because sometimes, remembering is all a father has left. I had fallen asleep in the armchair, an open book resting on my chest, its pages bowed slightly as if they'd exhaled with me. The sky outside had turned the color of bruised fruit, and the living room glowed with the low golden hue that only came during late afternoon in winter. I blinked slowly as the silence in the house reassembled itself around me, settling back into the corners it had occupied all day. The book was one Margaret used to love, a quiet novel about old things and quiet men. I had picked it up because it felt like something I was supposed to do, like wiping down the kitchen counters or checking the mail. The words hadn't stuck. I couldn't recall a single sentence I had read. My mind drifted too much now. It slipped between memory and present, refusing to stay tethered. I didn't fight it. Then the phone rang. The sharpness of the sound sliced through the stillness like a blade. It startled me so completely I nearly dropped the book. My heart, dull and slow for most of the day, kicked up hard against my ribs. I sat upright, trying to shake off the haze of half-sleep, and glanced toward the phone on the kitchen wall. No one called anymore. Not really. A few church friends had reached out in the days after the funeral, leaving soft-voiced messages full of comfort and scripture. A neighbor had called to offer a casserole, but that had all gone quiet, as it always does. Grief, after all, is a guest that everyone tolerates until it overstays its welcome. I let the phone ring twice more before I stood up and answered. The name on the caller ID stopped me. Alan. I stared at it, thumb hovering above the button. My son. My only child. I hadn't heard his voice I wasn't sure how long. Months, maybe longer. Not since before the hospital, before the machines, before Margaret's breath started to rasp and stagger. My thumb moved slowly, as if uncertain of its orders, and pressed the button. I held the receiver to my ear and said his name softly, unsure if he'd already hung up. The pause on the other end was brief, but it told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't called with emotion sitting in his throat. He hadn't called with any weight in his chest. He was composed, clean, distant. He said hello, the way someone says it to a bank teller or a technician. Flat, utilitarian. No, how are you? No, I've been thinking about you. Just a tone that told me I was being slotted into a schedule, a checkbox on a list. I waited, letting the silence stretch long enough to see if he'd fill it with something real. He didn't. He said he'd been meaning to reach out, that things had been busy. He mentioned Nicole, his wife, and the kids. He used phrases like running around and crazy days and non-stop. I listened, and each word rang hollow, like pebbles dropped in a dry well. He didn't say her name, not once, not Margaret, not Mom, not even the funeral. He spoke as if that part of life had been a page he'd already turned, one he wasn't planning to revisit. My hand tightened slightly around the phone. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, looking at the calendar she had marked with appointments she never kept, and I waited for a flicker of recognition in his voice. A moment of pause, a stumble. Nothing came. Then he got to the reason he called. He needed something. Money. He didn't say it with hesitation. He said it the way people order coffee or ask for a password reset. It wasn't a question. Not really. It was a presumption wrapped in politeness. He used words like tight spot and temporary bind. He used phrases like just until things level out and I'll get it back to you soon. He gave numbers, a specific amount, one that told me this call had been planned, maybe even rehearsed. I didn't say anything right away. I walked over to the sink and looked out the window. The yard was brittle with frost. The flower beds were bare. The treehouse, long since abandoned, sagged under the weight of time. I thought of all the days I had stood at this window, watching him play, call out, climb, grow. I thought of Margaret washing dishes beside me, smiling at his muddy face. Now there was only this voice, clean and clipped, asking for a wire transfer. He didn't ask how I was managing the nights. He didn't ask if I'd eaten, or if I'd been sleeping. He didn't wonder aloud what the house felt like now, without her footsteps, without her humming, without the tea kettle boiling in the early morning hours. He just kept talking. I let him. Somewhere in the middle of his explanation, something about car payments or daycare or a home repair I couldn't track, he mentioned how things were harder than people thought, how everyone's struggling. I listened to him describe stress like I had never known it, like my back hadn't carried steel poles in the dead of winter, like I hadn't sat in a hospital room for 11 nights straight, watching the monitors blink slower, like I hadn't held Margaret's hand as her breath slipped out in pieces. When he finished, he asked if it would be okay. Not if it was too much, not if I was able, just if it was okay. I said I'd think about it. There was a pause on the line. He hadn't expected that. I could feel the shift in his breath. He said something like, "Of course, take your time," but his tone had stiffened. He didn't offer to visit. He didn't ask when I last saw the grandkids. He just said, "Let me know," and hung up. I stood there for a long time, the phone still warm in my hand. The silence that followed was different. Not the emptiness of a quiet room, but the kind that fills you from the inside, makes your bones feel hollow. I placed the phone back in its cradle and looked around the kitchen again. Her mug still sat near the sink. Her apron still hung from the hook. The honey jar, the little spoon beside it, untouched. These things had meaning. These things had weight. I walked back to the chair in the den and sat down, slowly. My knees ached. My chest ached. I leaned back and closed my eyes. I listened to the furnace click on. I listened to the soft groan of the house settling deeper into winter. The call had ended, but its shape lingered in the room. I could still feel the outline of it. It was not a call of grief. It was not a call of love. It was a transaction disguised as conversation, and it left the house colder than before. The next morning, I awoke before dawn, not because of habit, but because sleep had become unfamiliar. My body followed old rhythms. Wake at 5, coffee by 5:15, sit in the same spot by the window before the sun crested the hill. But there was no comfort in the routine anymore. Only motion. Only the passing of time marked by the scrape of the chair on the floor and the slow drip of the coffee pot into the stained carafe. I sat at the kitchen table with the mug between my hands, untouched. The coffee had gone cold, but I hadn't noticed until I took a sip. I didn't heat it again. I let it sit, a dark reflection in a chipped cup that once had a pair. Margaret's had cracked months before her passing. She'd thrown it away with a sigh, and we never replaced it. Now I drank alone. The phone call from Alan the day before lingered like the echo of a door left ajar. It wasn't just his voice that haunted me. It was the way he'd spoken, the rhythm of it. Like I was a clerk, a gatekeeper, a resource, not a father. And yet, a part of me still clung to the idea that maybe he would call again, This time, different. This time, as a son. Around 10, the phone rang again. I didn't rush to answer. I let it ring until the final chime, then picked it up, already knowing who it was. His voice was brisk, polite, rehearsed. He said he'd been thinking about what he asked, said he understood it might have caught me off guard, said he hoped I didn't feel pressured. He used words that sounded soft, but carried a firm edge. He wanted to explain the situation a little better. He said the money wasn't for anything frivolous. It wasn't about wants. It was about needs. He said the furnace in their house had broken down. Repairs were expensive. The kids were cold. Nicole had been sick. They were barely keeping things afloat. He said it like he was describing a ship in a storm. But I knew the tone. I'd heard it before, in board meetings and job interviews and loan requests. It wasn't desperation. It was expectation. I asked him why he hadn't called after the funeral. My voice didn't shake, but something inside me did. He deflected, said things had been hectic, said grief hits people in different ways, said he didn't want to overwhelm me. Every sentence rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, like he'd prepared it all in advance. Then he returned to the number. The amount he needed, not large enough to seem outrageous, just enough to be uncomfortable. A figure that said, "I know you can afford this," even if he didn't say it aloud. He brought up the house. He brought up the savings account I'd opened for his college tuition all those years ago, the one he didn't use because he'd dropped out. He said I had always been good with money. He said Margaret would have wanted to help. That line cut deeper than the rest. He invoked her not with reverence, but as leverage. I said I needed time to think. He said he understood, but the undertone was different this time, slightly harder, slightly less patient. Like he believed that hesitating was just an old man's formality, something I'd work through before ultimately giving in. I told him I'd call him when I had made a decision. He said okay, then paused, then thanked me in advance. In advance, as if it were already done. When I hung up, I sat for a long time, staring at the blank wall above the table. It was beige, dull, harmless, like the kind of color people paint rooms they don't plan to inhabit. Margaret had once mentioned wanting to put a clock there, something antique. We never got around to it. Now I was glad. Time didn't deserve to hang over me just then. I thought about the furnace, about cold children, about illness and repairs and the price of heating oil. I thought about all the excuses we give each other and the ones we give ourselves, and I thought about the tone of his voice, how it had shifted from son to strategist, from kin to client. I had given him so much over the years, not just money, though there had been plenty of that, but time, sacrifices, weekends, vacations, sleepless nights. I remembered the summer when he wrecked the neighbor's car. I paid the damages without hesitation. I remembered the job interview he didn't show up for, and how I told the hiring manager he'd been sick, just to keep the door open for him. I remembered the mortgage help, the student loans, the down payment on their first place, the short-term assistance after his second layoff. Each time, I had told myself I was doing what fathers do. Each time, I thought I was investing in something that would return, eventually, in care, in connection, in closeness. But the returns had stopped coming long ago. I walked through the house slowly, as if the decision were tucked away in a drawer I hadn't opened yet. The living room felt colder than usual, though the thermostat hadn't moved. The framed photographs on the wall looked staged, like props from someone else's story. In one of them, Alan was 10, holding a fishing rod, beaming. I stood in the background, a hand on his shoulder, my smile smaller, but real. I touched the glass lightly, my fingertip smudging the surface. That boy no longer existed. And the man he became, he no longer looked for my hand on his shoulder. He only looked for the wallet in my back pocket. By late afternoon, I had made a list, just a small notepad from Margaret's sewing basket. On it, I wrote out all the financial help we had given him over the years. I didn't do it to guilt him. I did it to see it all in one place. The numbers were blunt. They didn't cry. They didn't explain. They just sat there, heavy with arithmetic. I realized how much I had spent trying to keep a relationship alive through transaction. It had started with baseball uniforms and birthday parties and ended with co-signed loans and unanswered calls. The request in itself wasn't the problem. It was the pattern, the assumption, the erosion of gratitude replaced by entitlement. I put the list in the drawer beside Margaret's old recipes. Then I poured another cup of coffee, still not warm, and sat again by the window. The sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows that reached across the lawn like fingers searching for something they'd dropped. I sat still and let the quiet hold me. The request lingered, but I no longer held it in the center of my thoughts. I had shifted. I had moved something internal that had been rigid for years. The boy I remembered had once asked for help to build a birdhouse. The man he became now asked for help to fix a life that seemed built on expectations, not on love. And I was beginning to understand the difference. I didn't move for hours after that second call. The house had grown darker around me, though I hadn't noticed the light fading. Shadows crept along the edges of the room, reaching across the walls like the slow drag of time itself. The coffee had long since gone cold in my hands, but I held the mug anyway, like an anchor. I didn't sip. I didn't even blink much. I just stared through the window at nothing in particular, caught in a stillness that wasn't peace. Something had changed in me. I couldn't name it yet, but I could feel its weight. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It wasn't sadness either, although both emotions hovered nearby, like animals waiting for permission to come closer. It was something heavier, denser, a kind of quiet understanding that settled inside my chest like a stone dropped into water. It didn't thrash or scream. It simply sank and stayed. I had spent most of my life believing in repair, that everything broken could be fixed if you applied the right pressure, the right patience, the right love. I had worked with my hands my whole life. I knew the sound of rotting beams and warped flooring. I knew how to reinforce something before it collapsed. But this was different. There was nothing left to fix, because nothing had been broken suddenly. It had eroded over time, like a shoreline pulled out by an invisible tide. I rose slowly, the stiffness in my knees reminding me that my body no longer followed orders easily. I walked through the house without a destination, trailing my fingers along the edges of furniture, picture frames, doorways. Every surface held memory, but none of them offered answers, just questions that echoed too long. When I reached the hallway, I stopped in front of the small hall closet. Margaret's sweaters were still hanging inside, wrapped in the scent of lavender and old wood. I opened the door and touched the sleeve of her favorite gray cardigan. She had worn it on chilly mornings when the furnace hadn't yet kicked in, clutching her tea and shuffling in slippers across the tile. I closed the door again, careful not to let it creak. I went into the bedroom next and stood beside the bed, looking down at the side that had stayed untouched since she left it. The pillow still held the shape of her head. The blanket was turned back slightly, the way it had been that last morning when she said she didn't feel well and wanted to lie down for a bit. I hadn't made the bed since. It felt wrong, like erasing something. I sat on the edge of the mattress and let my shoulders slump. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried. Not really. Not at the hospital. Not during the service. Not even at the burial. It wasn't pride that kept the tears away. It was something deeper. A hollowing out. A dryness that came from too many years of swallowing emotion instead of expressing it. I was raised in a time when men didn't cry unless someone died in their arms. And even then, they did it in private. What I felt now wasn't sorrow. It was resignation. I had spent my entire life reaching toward people who kept stepping back. Alan had once been a boy who ran to me when he was scared. He'd grip my leg like it was a tree trunk and refuse to let go until the thunder stopped or the dog next door stopped barking. He had trusted me with everything: his scraped knees, his math homework, his secrets. But over the years, that grip had loosened. It hadn't happened all at once. It was gradual, an inch at a time. Now he only reached for me when his balance faltered, not for comfort, not for connection, but for leverage. That knowledge lodged itself deeper inside me. The stone shifted slightly. It didn't hurt, not in a sharp way. It was more like pressure, a dull weight that I carried not because I wanted to, but because I finally understood I had been carrying it for years already, just hadn't noticed how much it had shaped my posture. I stood again and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room. It was where Margaret used to write letters, real ones, with pen and paper. She believed in the intimacy of handwriting, said it showed care, said the way ink bent around a person's name mattered more than pixels on a screen. The last letter she wrote had been to a friend in Illinois. She never sent it. It was still there, in the drawer, addressed but unsealed. I sat at the desk and opened the drawer. The letter was there, folded neatly, with a pressed flower tucked between the pages. She always did things like that. Small details, quiet gestures, things that didn't need to be seen to be felt. I set the letter aside and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. I wasn't sure why. I didn't plan to write back to Alan. I didn't have anything left to explain. But I felt the urge to move my hand, to make a mark, to prove I still could. Instead of writing, I just held the pen over the page for a long time. Eventually, I placed it down again and closed the drawer. There was nothing to write that wouldn't become evidence against me in my own heart. I went back to the kitchen and sat at the table, the silence folding around me like thick fabric. The request Alan had made wasn't the heaviest part. It was the ease with which he had made it, the assumption, the casual way he had looked past what had just happened, what I had just lived through, and replaced it with a calculation. He hadn't asked how I was coping. He hadn't mentioned her name. He hadn't paused to wonder if I might need anything. Time, space, even a simple, "How are you, Dad?" He had called, and he had asked, and he had waited for an answer that felt inevitable. But it wasn't. And in that realization, something in me solidified. I had always been the one to bend, to understand, to excuse, to explain, to give. I had done it because I believed that was love, that was duty, that was being a father. But love without recognition becomes obligation, and obligation without reciprocity becomes weight. The stone inside me was that weight, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to put it down. I was simply learning to carry it differently. I didn't know what I would tell him yet. I didn't know what I would say when he called again, as I knew he would. But I knew one thing. I would not give what I no longer owed, not because I was angry, not because I wanted to teach him a lesson, but because I had finally started learning my own. The morning air was colder than it should have been for early spring. I stepped into the garage with a cardigan pulled over my shoulders, my breath visible in short bursts. The fluorescent light above buzzed softly, casting long, pale shadows across the concrete floor. Dust hung in the air, and the silence here felt older, heavier, like it belonged to the bones of the house itself. I hadn't opened the safe in a long time. Years, maybe. It sat tucked behind a row of shelves in the far corner, camouflaged by paint cans, rusted garden shears, and a box of broken Christmas lights we never bothered to untangle. The concrete beneath it was cracked, the floor sloping slightly towards the drain, but the safe had remained steady, like a stone buried into the heart of the earth. I pulled the shelves aside carefully, wincing as one of the metal frames groaned against the floor. My knees didn't bend the way they used to, so I crouched slow, lowering myself in stages until I was eye level with the dial. My fingers hesitated, hovering just above the cold steel before turning the mechanism. I didn't need to think about the combination. It was one of those things my hands remembered better than my mind. The numbers moved like breath. Right, left, right again. And then, the soft click. The door opened with the dry resistance of something rarely used. Inside were documents, bundled folders, envelopes, a few certificates in crisp plastic sleeves. There was no money, no valuables in the usual sense, just the kind of paperwork that says more about a person than their photo albums ever could. And in the back, under a folder marked Insurance Final, was the envelope I had sealed with Margaret the year she got sick. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a plain white envelope, thick with its contents, the paper inside yellowing at the edges where it had absorbed time and humidity. I pulled it out gently and sat down on the old workbench, my legs trembling slightly under the weight of effort and memory. We had prepared it together, not in anger, not in fear, but in clarity. She had known before I did that certain things needed to be decided early. She had said it plainly one morning over coffee, that she didn't want the end of her life to create more mess than the living years already had. That love didn't mean always hoping. It sometimes meant preparing. We had talked about the house, about the accounts, about what was fair, what was right. She had looked at me with those steady eyes and said, "Let's not let grief turn into confusion or guilt." I had nodded because I couldn't argue with her then, not when her voice sounded so sure and her hands shook only slightly when she signed the pages. The contents of the envelope had not changed since that day. Inside was the final version of our joint will, not the older draft, not the one that left everything to Alan in the naive belief that time would soften him and distance would disappear. This one was different. It named another beneficiary, a quiet organization Margaret had supported for years, a Veterans Outreach Foundation that helped widowed spouses and aging caregivers find stability, dignity, peace. People like us, but forgotten. People who wouldn't look at grief as an inconvenience, but as a language they already spoke. The decision had not come lightly, but it had come with certainty. Alan hadn't been a bad son, not always, but he had stopped being a present one long before Margaret's final days. And when it came to pain, real pain, the kind that presses into the walls of the home like smoke, he had chosen to stay out of the house entirely. Now he was asking for what remained of us, not because he loved us, but because we had been useful. I set the envelope on the bench and looked at it for a long while. It was strange how something so thin, so fragile could hold so much finality. Not vengeance, not even judgment, just truth. It was our truth, Margaret's and mine, signed in ink and quiet resolve. I slid the envelope into a manila folder and sealed it. Then I opened the bottom drawer of the bench and pulled out an old padded mailer, the kind used for shipping books or documents. I placed the folder inside and sealed it with 2 strips of tape. I didn't label it. I didn't need to. Not yet. The garage smelled like oil and winter. I sat there on the stool a bit longer, thinking about the years, about all the birthdays I had shown up for, about the nights I had driven across counties to help Alan with plumbing, with taxes, with errands he didn't want to do alone. I thought about the Christmas dinners he had skipped, the hospital room he hadn't entered, the call he didn't make. I stood slowly, joints protesting. I walked the envelope back into the house, setting it on the small desk in the hallway, the same one where we used to sort mail, pay bills, and leave each other notes in passing. Dinner at 6. Don't forget milk. You look tired. Rest. Those notes had stopped when the illness arrived. The last one I found from her, scrawled on a post-it, had simply said, "Thank you." I sat down at the desk and pulled a note card from the drawer. I didn't say much, just his name, written at the top. Below that, a single sentence. "This is the gift you earned." I didn't sign it. I slipped the card inside the envelope and resealed the whole thing. No ribbon, no wrapping, no sentimentality. Just a plain message in a plain package. It was, after all, a kind of gift. A gift of truth, a gift of boundary, a gift of letting go. I placed the envelope in the center of the desk and turned off the light. Then I walked back into the kitchen, poured the last of the cold coffee down the sink, and stood there for a moment, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. The gift had been prepared, and with it, something inside me, some small raw part, had finally settled. Not healed, but settled, as if the stone within me had found the place where it belonged. The legal office was in a converted Victorian house on the quiet end of Main Street, the kind of place that looked more like a bed and breakfast than a law firm. The porch had peeling white paint and a planter box full of browning petunias. The sign out front read, "Law Offices of Gregory W. Emery," and beneath it, in smaller type, "Estates, Wills, and Family Law." I parked out front and sat in the truck for a few minutes before going in. The engine ticked as it cooled. The sky was overcast again, a constant lately, as if even the weather had decided not to speak too loudly. I had called the office a day earlier and said I needed to finalize something. The receptionist had asked if I was updating an existing will, and I said no. It was already written, already signed. I just needed it recorded and made real. She booked me for 10:30 the next morning. I liked that she didn't ask questions, just gave me a time and directions for parking. When I stepped into the office, the air inside smelled like lemon polish and paper. The receptionist was a woman around 60, her hair clipped short and silver, her glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She smiled politely and asked my name, then led me down a hallway where the wooden floorboards creaked under my boots. Gregory Emery was younger than I'd expected, late 40s, maybe early 50s, with a tidy beard and a voice that had learned how to sound calm under pressure. He stood when I entered and gestured toward a chair opposite his desk. I nodded, sat down, and placed the sealed envelope on the table between us, like it was something fragile. He didn't reach for it right away. He looked at me instead, waiting. I appreciated that. I told him what it was, a joint will, signed already, witnessed, but never filed. I said my wife had passed. He offered his condolences. I nodded once and looked down at my hands. I didn't want to talk about her. Not there. Not with him. That part was done. He opened the envelope and began to review the contents, page by page, his eyes moving with the practiced rhythm of a man who had read hundreds of similar documents. But this one was mine. Ours. Every line had been written with a clear mind and a full heart, though neither felt present now. When he finished reading, he asked a few basic questions. Was this the final version? Were there any amendments? Had anything changed since it was signed? I answered everything plainly. No changes, no disputes, just the truth. He nodded, then asked if I wanted a certified copy made. I said yes. One to keep, one for the records, one to send eventually. He handed me a pen and pointed to the line where my final signature was needed. I looked at the page for a moment before lowering the pen. My hand trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the weight of the moment. Signing something like that feels more permanent than a headstone. It closes a door that doesn't swing open again. The ink flowed dark and smooth. I wrote my full name, the way I hadn't in years. Not just Dad, not Harold, the whole name. The one Margaret had spoken only when serious or soft. When I finished, I placed the pen down and folded my hands in my lap. He made a copy right there in the office. The machine hummed quietly while I stared out the window. A child walked by on the sidewalk, holding his mother's hand, bouncing slightly with each step. His backpack was too big for him, and he wore it proudly. I wondered if Alan had ever looked that small to me, if I'd ever held his hand like that, in public, without thinking twice about it. The copies came out warm. He handed them to me in a folder stamped with the firm's logo. I took it gently, as if it were something delicate. In a way, it was. He asked if there was anything else he could do. I said no. He stood and shook my hand with both of his, and there was something respectful in it. I appreciated that too. Some people know how to touch grief without prodding it. He was one of them. Back in the truck, I placed the folder on the passenger seat and sat for a while. The heat was off, but I didn't feel cold. I didn't feel much at all. Just tired. Not from the drive or the meeting, but from years of holding back the tide of disappointment. It takes effort to hope for change when the same waves keep coming in. The drive home was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. The folder sat beside me, closed tight, humming with finality. I knew what I had done, and I knew why. At a red light, I glanced at the glove compartment and remembered a drawing Alan had once made, a crayon sketch of our house with stick figures out front. He had drawn a dog we never had, and a chimney with puffs of smoke curling upward like question marks. He must have been 5 or 6. Margaret had kept that drawing for years, tucked in a photo album. I hadn't seen it in a long time. The light turned green. I drove on. When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the truck, one hand resting on the folder, and looked at the front porch. The wind had knocked over a small planter. The soil had spilled in a dark crescent across the steps. I didn't get out to clean it. I just watched it, unmoving, the way you sometimes watch a slow leak before deciding whether to fix it. Eventually, I stepped out and went inside. The house greeted me with its usual hush. I placed the folder on the hallway table, right beside Margaret's reading glasses and a small bowl of peppermints she hadn't touched since the winter before her diagnosis. I didn't move them. I just added the folder to the still life, like it had always belonged there. I went into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and drank it slowly. My hand felt steadier now. The kind of steady that comes after a decision has been made, and can't be unmade. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel bitter. I felt aligned, like something had clicked back into place, not with fanfare, not with drama, but with quiet precision. That piece of paper, signed and sealed, had drawn a line in the sand I could finally stop crossing. I had made my choice, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like mine. He arrived without warning. No call, no message, just the sound of tires crunching over gravel as I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a plate I hadn't used. The kind of sound that doesn't belong unless you're expecting someone. I turned off the tap, dried my hands slowly, and moved to the front window. The truck was his, silver, still with the dent near the rear wheel from a parking lot somewhere years ago. A familiar vehicle, but it might as well have been a stranger's. He got out quickly, like a man on an errand, not a visit. He didn't look at the house before walking toward it. No hesitation in his stride. No sense that he might be arriving into a place that held grief in the walls. He didn't pause on the porch or glance at the worn welcome mat Margaret had picked out for fall, the one that still said, "Hello, pumpkin." He just rang the bell once and stood there, hands in his coat pockets, chin slightly raised like he had already decided how the conversation would go. I didn't answer the door right away. I made him wait, not out of spite, but because I needed the moment. I needed to feel the beat between arrival and expectation. I needed to gather the silence, like breath. When I finally opened the door, he smiled, tight, polite, almost convincing. The kind of smile people use when trying to manage a situation. Not a smile for family. Not a smile for loss. He said my name like a formality. I nodded and stepped back, letting him in without words. He entered as though he still remembered the layout, though his eyes skimmed the furniture like he was checking for changes, as if the grief of a house should rearrange itself to make room for him. He walked ahead of me, into the living room, and sat on the edge of the couch like he had somewhere to be soon. His hands rubbed together, cold, maybe nervous, though I doubted it. He glanced at the photographs on the mantel, then back at me. There were no questions about how I was doing, no mention of her name, no shared silence in memory, just a shift in posture, a clearing of the throat, and then, business. He brought up the conversation from earlier in the week, the call, the money, the pressure he'd hinted at, but hadn't admitted. Now he laid it out more plainly. Expenses, deadlines, needs. He used words like tight window and urgent, like we were closing a deal. He said he'd tried to wait, but things were moving fast. He spoke with the assurance of someone used to yes. I listened. I stood across from him, my arms loosely folded, the envelope resting on the hallway table just behind me. I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod. I didn't offer tea or coffee. This wasn't that kind of visit. When he finished, he looked up with the practiced look of someone who had learned how to appear humble at the right time. Not truly vulnerable, just calculated sincerity, like he had taught himself the face he thought people wanted to see. I stepped into the hall and returned with the envelope. It was heavier than it looked, not in weight, but in meaning. My fingers wrapped around it the way you hold something that could change a person, something that could open a door or close it for good. I handed it to him without a word. He took it with a slight smile, assuming it was what he wanted. The money, probably. A check, a gesture of goodwill, a confirmation that the dynamic had not changed. He slipped a finger under the flap and pulled it open right there on the couch. The silence that followed was unlike any I had known in this house. He didn't look up at first. His eyes scanned the papers, and I watched the lines of his face tighten. The confusion came slowly, like a fog rolling in. His brows drew inward. His mouth fell into a flat line. His fingers stilled over the edge of the document. I remained standing. I didn't need to speak. Everything I could have said had already been printed, signed, and sealed. He turned the page once, twice. Then again, as if expecting something to change the further he looked. But nothing changed. Not in the ink, not in the language, not in the signature. When he finally looked at me, his face was pale, not with rage, not with sorrow, but with realization. That something had ended. Not dramatically, not with a scream or a slammed door, but with paper. Quiet paper. Paper that bore no threats, no insults, just names, and his wasn't one of them. Still I said nothing. He held the will in his hands like something foreign, like it had been written in a language he had forgotten how to read. I could see the questions forming behind his eyes, but I didn't invite them. I didn't offer clarification. I didn't owe any. He sat there for another moment, then slowly folded the papers and placed them back inside the envelope. His hands moved differently, now, carefully, almost reverently. He sealed it as if unsure what to do with it, whether to keep it, to protest it, to tear it in half. I turned and walked into the kitchen. I didn't look back to see if he followed. I poured myself a glass of water, and by the time I returned to the living room, he was standing, still holding the envelope, still processing. He looked at me again. This time, the smile was gone. His expression was blank, save for the small twitch at the corner of his jaw. A muscle tightening, a breath caught. I thought for a second he might speak, that something human might slip through. But no words came. I walked to the door and opened it. Not a gesture of rejection, just closure, just boundary. He stepped out slowly, his footsteps heavy, deliberate. The sky was the same color it had been when he arrived, gray, indifferent. He didn't turn back as he reached his truck. He opened the door, climbed in, started the engine. I watched from the porch, hands in my pockets, and when the truck pulled away, taking the envelope, the silence returned. But it was not the same. It no longer pressed against my chest. It no longer felt like waiting. It felt like air, like room, like space that had finally been claimed. By the time I closed the door behind me, I knew something had settled. I hadn't given him what he wanted, but I had given him something else, something final, a gift wrapped in truth, and in the silence that followed, I felt no guilt, only the calm that comes when you no longer confuse duty with surrender. Long after he left, I remained by the door, hand resting on the frame, listening to the hum of his truck fading down the road. The house, once again, became still. I didn't move for some time. I let the silence settle into me, not as an absence of sound, but as confirmation. Something had ended, not with thunder or fire, just with a folded piece of paper he hadn't expected, a document whose weight he didn't recognize until he felt it shifting in his hands. I imagined him driving, his fingers tapping the steering wheel, the envelope on the passenger seat like a sleeping animal he didn't know how to wake. I imagined the itch in his mind, the questions circling without answers, the slow-burning realization that something had truly shifted, that the rules he thought governed us no longer applied. He hadn't opened it fully while he was here. Not everything. Not the cover letter. Not the note I'd tucked between the pages. He had read the top of the will, the names, the date, the designation. But I knew he hadn't read the whole thing. Not yet. He would wait until he was alone, until his wife was out of the room, until the children were in bed, and the house dimmed to low lamps and creaking floors. Then he would tear through it, page by page, trying to find the mistake. But there was no mistake. The will was clean, clear, ironclad, crafted with care, witnessed legally, filed appropriately. The language left no room for interpretation. The estate, the house, the savings, all of it was to be transferred to the organization Margaret had chosen. The one she had quietly supported for more than 20 years. A place that helped people who had no one. Veterans, widows, caregivers forgotten by their families. People who knew grief not as a season, but as a home. She had chosen them not out of bitterness, but out of alignment. She once told me, her voice low and without malice, that she didn't believe money should reward absence. That support, emotional, physical, spiritual, ought to be met with presence, not just blood. I had agreed then. I agreed now. The envelope also included a copy of a letter she had written, never mailed, addressed to our son. I had found it in one of her notebooks after she passed. It wasn't bitter, but it was honest. She had written about her loneliness during her illness, about the hospital visits that never came, about the phone calls that turned into excuses, and then into silence. She hadn't blamed him directly. She had only described. She'd painted the truth with the soft brush of someone who still hoped it might reach the one it was meant for. I didn't edit the letter. I left it exactly as she wrote it, in her uneven handwriting, with one crossed-out sentence and a tea stain on the margin. I folded it gently and placed it inside a smaller envelope, paper-clipped to the back of the will. That was the true gift. Not the will, not the money withheld, but the letter. The truth she could never say aloud. The feeling she carried to the end, but never laid at his feet. Not in person. Now, in ink and silence, she had done so, and I had delivered it. I sat at the table, staring at the space where the envelope had been. The wood underneath still held the faint rectangle of dustless polish, like a negative space burned into the grain. I traced my finger around the edge, a phantom border, and thought about how many years I had filled that house with hoping. Not for wealth, not for comfort, just for recognition, for a kind of closeness that never returned. I didn't hate him. That would have been easier somehow. Cleaner. What I felt was older than hate, more tired. Like an orchard that had been picked over so many times, it stopped bearing fruit. The soil had given all it could. The trees stood, but the roots had retreated. The secret inside that envelope wasn't just the legal shift of assets. It was the revelation of truth. A mirror held up to a relationship that had long since become lopsided. A quiet, measured way to say, this is what love should look like, and this is what was missing. It wasn't punishment. It was a final boundary. He would read the letter in pieces. He would skim, then return, then read again, slower. He might call, but I wouldn't answer. Not for a while. Not until he understood that this wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about showing him clearly and without apology that love without presence is not love at all. I stood and walked to the window. The trees outside swayed gently in the wind, their bare branches moving like they were whispering to each other. Across the street, the neighbor's dog barked once, then quieted. The world had kept turning. Even without the confrontation I used to rehearse in my mind. Even without the dramatic scene I once imagined we'd have. There was no explosion, just a decision, made in stillness, delivered in silence. And now, the silence that filled the house wasn't loneliness anymore. It was something else, something earned, a kind of peace, a kind of proof. The envelope had left, but what remained was certainty, and that, in the end, was the real inheritance. The next day passed in fragments. I woke before the sun, not because of restlessness, but because something inside me had settled into a rhythm of early rising that sleep could no longer interrupt. The house remained dark until I turned on the kitchen light, which buzzed once before, casting a soft, golden circle over the countertops. I didn't make coffee. I didn't toast bread. I simply stood with both hands flat against the counter, listening to the hush that came before morning. I thought about calling someone, maybe one of the men from church, or the neighbor who'd offered to stop by more often. But the idea of conversation felt foreign, not heavy or unpleasant, just unnecessary. As if words had done all they could for now, and anything spoken would only dilute the quiet truth already settling around me, like dust. Later that morning, I stepped outside to sweep the porch. It had rained overnight, and the boards were slick, the wind still damp and curling around the edges of my coat. The planter Margaret once tended was half full of rotting leaves, the soil hard and unforgiving. I didn't clean it. I let it be. Some things weren't meant to be saved this season. I spent most of the day in small, measured tasks, folding laundry that barely filled the basket, dusting the tops of shelves no one else would notice, sorting through drawers with receipts so old the ink had faded. I wasn't avoiding anything. I wasn't waiting. I was simply existing, moment to moment, the way a man does after a long breath has finally been exhaled. The call came just after 4. I saw his name flash on the screen and didn't move. I let it ring until it stopped, then stared at the silence it left behind. He didn't call again, but I knew. I could see him in my mind, seated somewhere, his office maybe, or their kitchen table. The envelope opened. The papers splayed out like a game he had lost without knowing the rules. The will, signed and final. The letter from his mother, creased and soft-edged, written in her neat, slanting script. I pictured his fingers trembling just slightly as he read it, trying to anticipate a loophole in her tone, some gesture of forgiveness tucked into the margins. But it wasn't there. Just truth. I imagined the look on his face, not fury, not confusion, something quieter. The kind of stunned stillness that only comes when you realize the road you thought was straight had ended at a cliff. Not with warning signs, not with flashing lights, just an edge. Perhaps he read the letter twice. Perhaps he didn't finish it at all. Either way, I knew what had passed through him. Because I had felt it myself once, years ago, when I found a note my own father had left in the garage after his second heart attack. A short scribbled line on a yellow pad that read, "I thought I had more time." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything he ever said while alive, because it was not written for performance. It was not offered as instruction. It was private, unfinished, honest. That's what Margaret had given him, and I had given it to him without commentary. He hadn't come back. There was no knock at the door, no slam of tires up the drive, only the call that rang once. That was enough. I didn't need his reaction spelled out. I knew it the way a tree knows when lightning has passed close. It can feel the scorch without looking. Somewhere inside him, something had broken. But it was not the kind of break that makes noise. It was the kind that shifts your footing, that moves the ground a half-inch beneath you. You still stand, but differently. You don't fall. You just find that the air feels altered, as if someone opened a window you hadn't noticed before. That evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my legs and watched the street grow quiet. The last of the daylight stretched thin across the road. A young couple walked by with a stroller. A black cat darted across a neighbor's lawn. A boy on a bicycle passed, his coat flapping behind him like wings. I held a cup of tea in my hands, though I had no intention of drinking it. I liked the warmth against my palms. It reminded me that I still had a body, that my fingers still knew how to hold something without trembling. I didn't think about what he might say next, or whether he would try again to explain. I didn't rehearse any conversations. I didn't prepare for defense. There was nothing left to argue. The facts had already been delivered, unwrapped in the silence of his own home. That was where the real reckoning happened, not between two people, but between a person and their own conscience. He had lived with the assumption that he would always be forgiven. That absence was a small thing, easily patched with presence when it suited him, that the past didn't tally debts. But it did, not out of cruelty, not for revenge, but because love, when unreturned, begins to calcify. It becomes a wall, not a bridge. And Margaret, gentle, patient Margaret, had built that wall with quiet hands, long before her final breath. I heard the mail slot creak once, and then the shuffle of envelopes falling to the floor. I didn't move to retrieve them. I sat still, watching the final strands of light disappear behind the rooftops. Somewhere, he sat too, in a house now holding more silence than before. Not the peaceful kind, not yet, but the kind that marks a beginning, not of reconciliation, but of reckoning. And that, I understood, was more powerful than any words I could have spoken. The morning after the call, I woke to a silence that felt different, not the heavy kind that presses down on the chest or echoes through empty rooms. This was a silence that breathed, a silence that waited with me, instead of around me. I opened my eyes before the light reached the windows and lay still, listening. Not for voices, not for footsteps, not even for my own thoughts, just listening. There was no message on the phone, no knock at the door, no hurried apology or half-measured attempt at repair. The silence remained uninterrupted, and I accepted it without resistance. Something had closed, finally, and I had not been the one to shut it. I made coffee, but I didn't drink it right away. I left the mug near the window, steam rising in slow spirals. I stepped onto the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The early sun was low, thin, uncertain. The street was quiet, as if the world itself understood the shape of what had passed. The envelope was gone. The decision was made. My name had sealed it. Margaret's too. Our final act together, written in ink and quiet conviction. I thought about her more gently now, not with the sharpness of grief or the ache of memory, but with a soft kind of closeness. She was everywhere still, in the corners of the home, in the cadence of the floorboards, in the weight of the silence. But she no longer haunted the rooms. She filled them, like light, like breath. The chair in the living room remained untouched, her blanket still draped across the back. I had stopped reaching for it, not out of denial, but out of peace. There was no need to chase her scent anymore, or replay the sound of her voice in my head. She had already said everything she needed to say. She had left me with more than memories. She had left me with direction. I moved through the house that day with less hesitation. I cleaned out the drawer in the hallway that had become a clutter of old chargers, takeout menus, and expired coupons. I gathered 2 boxes of clothes and set them by the door, ready to donate. I vacuumed the corners of the guest room and opened the window, letting fresh air replace the stillness. It wasn't reinvention. It wasn't transformation. It was something simpler, a reclaiming. I ate lunch at the table, not in front of the television. I chewed slowly, paying attention to the texture of food I would have once ignored. I washed the dishes without music. I dried them with Margaret's old towel and placed everything back exactly where it belonged. That afternoon, I walked to the edge of the property and trimmed the hedges. They had overgrown in recent weeks. I took my time, making careful cuts, finding the rhythm in the work. The air was brisk but not cold. My hands moved with steadiness I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. Across the street, the neighbor's boy waved. I lifted a hand back. Nothing grand, just acknowledgement, a quiet yes to being part of the world again. By dusk, I had lit a small candle on the table beside the chair, not as a ritual, not as a vigil, just as a light to mark the evening. I sat across from it, sipping tea, feeling no urge to speak, no need to fill the air with sound. Alan did not call again, not that day, not the one after, and that, too, became part of the new silence. A silence that now belonged to me, not imposed, not mourned, but chosen. I did not expect him to come back. I did not wait for him to change. I let the past rest where it lay. Not forgiven, not forgotten, just set down. I found myself thinking less about what I had lost and more about what I had carried. The weight of always being the one to reach first, the one to repair, to explain, to excuse. That weight had lifted, not all at once, but gradually, with every page of that will, with every quiet morning that followed. The silence I lived in now was not absence. It was presence. It was clarity. It was the sound of no longer asking permission to feel what I felt, to choose what I chose, to live as I had earned. At night, I left the bedroom door slightly open. I no longer feared the darkness. I no longer waited for the phone to ring. I slept with the window cracked, letting the wind carry in whatever it wanted to bring. There were no goodbyes left to speak, no speeches to prepare, only a house filled with air that moved freely again, only rooms that no longer echoed, but held space, only me. And it was enough, because sometimes what begins in silence ends in peace. And peace, I had learned, doesn't come when people return. It comes when you stop waiting.